The fire alarm is blaring, shrill and unrelenting, but the sound only enrages the 6 monsters further. The plant can feel them closing in, pounding down the corridor like wild animals. Abandoned crash carts fly, vacant wheelchairs topple, and anything in their path is smashed aside without hesitation. They're driven by nothing but raw, feral instinct that emanates from under that mass of tumorous flesh. It's hard to believe they used to be human. The plant slams against a set of double doors, but they don't open, the weight of something on the other side refusing to budge. There's empty hospital beds and disconnected EKG machines piled up to form a barricade. A stand for an IV drip is wedged between the door's handles. Frantically, the plant bangs on the door, slamming his fists against the surface until they start to hurt. On the other side, he sees frightened doctors, nurses, and patients through the window, cowering and keeping well back from the door. He yells, insisting he's not one of those things. He hasn't been infected. He desperately shows them the clean skin of his hands and arms in the hopes that'll be enough to convince them. His plea for entry seems to work, as one of the orderlies starts shifting parts of the barricade to grant him entry. Just as the doors start to open slightly, one of the creatures comes racing around the corner at the far end of the corridor behind the plant. He screams to the orderly clearing the obstructions on the other side, pushing at the doors, though the pile of beds and the IV stand prevent them from opening. In desperation, the plant forces himself through the small gap between the 2 doors, despite the pain of feeling both doors crushing his ribs. With another yell and a sickening crack, he makes it through, just as the monster slams into the double doors, causing them to buckle. Hurriedly, the orderly and others in the room start pushing the barricade back into place. The creature's arm reaches through the 2 doors, preventing them from shutting. Over in a nearby corner, the plant is cowering, doubled over in pain, crying horrified tears. Carefully, the plant lifts up the sleeve of the stolen lab coat he wears. On his arm are lesions, marks he remembers seeing on the patients he infected, including the one trying to break in. The mandate from the corporation is simple: infiltrate the hospital under the assumed identity of an ordinary doctor and administer the provided samples to patients on different wards. Treat the place like your own private lab, they tell their plant. Move without any pattern so you aren't noticed, and make sure you monitor the data closely. They haven't explained exactly what they're hoping to get out of this test, but the reason they're keeping it such a secret is clear enough. These patients are being used as guinea pigs for something big. As for what, the plant doesn't know. He isn't being paid to ask questions, just produce results. After a month or so of working at the hospital under his new identity, the first hermetically sealed delivery from the corporation arrives. He brings the sample to work, chooses a patient at random, and takes the sample out, administering it to the patient while they sleep. It's a nasty one, measles, but luckily for the patient, they'd already had their shots. The process continues like this for months. Getting sick while in hospital is hardly uncommon, allowing the plant to work undetected. Then, one day, the corporation sends something that they make sure to point out is of the utmost importance. They won't explain further, referring to this mysterious sample only as Sample BEA. Unlike the others, the plant is given different instructions. Expose as many patients as possible to Sample BEA, preferably those in close proximity to each other. Slipping back into the hospital during the shift change, when day staff are clocking out and night staff are still getting settled, the plant moves quickly, quietly. He heads for a quiet ward, one that won't be checked for a while. 6 sleeping patients, 6 guinea pigs, 6 monsters. Since the quarantine was lifted, SCP Foundation immunologists and other researchers specializing in anomalous infections have examined the recovered samples and determined the exact cause of the outbreak. The resultant discovery has been designated SCP-253. Close examination of cell samples yielded little results, with many of the recovered samples being human cells that had been exposed to various common treatable or even curable diseases. Among the evidence requisitioned by the Centers for Disease Control from the redacted Pharmaceutical Corporation was one sample that Foundation analysts considered to be abnormal. Under a microscope, the sample appeared to be a cluster of undifferentiated human skin cells. In this context, the term undifferentiated is used to refer to any cells or tissue matter that don't possess specialized or mature structures or functions. When cross-referenced with medical analysis of various other forms of undifferentiated cells, Foundation researchers quickly noted that the cluster of cells they had found shared a majority of physiological traits with most forms of cancer. And in terms of cancer, undifferentiated cells can grow and spread rapidly. With the sample identified and suspected to be anomalous in nature, the SCP Foundation immediately ordered a series of thorough containment and testing procedures. All experiments were to be conducted within sterilized environments, where pathogen levels and potential contaminants could be strictly monitored to prevent cross-contamination or the risk of a secondary outbreak. Initial testing involved extracting cells from the anomalous material, now formally cataloged as SCP-253, and placing them under controlled conditions designed to encourage cellular growth and observe any abnormal development. Anomalous biologist teams worked on cultivating SCP-253 cell structures, growing test samples of the anomalous cells while keeping them isolated from living tissue in order to observe their behavior. They already knew of SCP-253. What they were seeking to establish was whether it would act like cancer, growing and dividing at an uncontrollable rate, attacking healthy cells by interfering with the bodily signals that normally regulate their growth. By placing cells from SCP-253 into controlled cell culture environments, Foundation research teams quickly confirmed a troubling pattern. The cells behaved remarkably like aggressive cancerous tissue. If the cells were provided with an adequate and regular source of nutrition, they would continue to grow until they split off and multiplied. It appeared, at the rate of mitosis occurring, that these anomalous cells could potentially grow indefinitely if they had constant access to nutrition, like if they were found to have occurred within living human tissue. An emergency lockdown of Foundation Site, Redacted, was triggered shortly after the first few weeks of testing concluded. An unknown member of research personnel gained access to the labs where SCP-253 cell cultures were under examination. It remains unclear as to why this researcher chose to forcibly enter a restricted, controlled environment area without taking the adequate safety measures. Any communications they might have received prior to the attempt have been lost, as the hard drive to their personal computer was found to have been dissolved using acid, along with the SIM card of their cell phone. A subsequent investigation by the SCP Foundation's Office of Internal Affairs concluded that this individual may have accepted a bribe from the Redacted Pharmaceutical Corporation, or another anomalous group of interest, to recover samples of SCP-253 and deliver them to this unidentified benefactor. The occurrence of this attempted theft of dangerous anomalous material and the subsequent lockdown, however, led to the discovery of SCP-253's primary anomalous properties. The Foundation biology teams assigned to the cell culture tests found themselves trapped within Site Redacted's biochemical testing wing, as Foundation protocol required a minimum of a 72-hour quarantine to prevent the spread of any anomalous pathogen. This time was used by the researchers to examine what had happened to SCP-253's would-be thief. They quickly learned, just from observing the testing labs, that SCP-253 was contagious. Despite its cellular behavior resembling that of a cancer, the anomaly was able to pass from human to human and could even infect some select animal species. This was observed when some mice, kept for testing purposes, were freed from their enclosure in the lab and came into close contact with the remains of the unidentified member of personnel infected with SCP-253. Researchers observed that SCP-253 did not appear to function as an airborne pathogen, though all personnel were still required to wear hazmat suits and rebreathers for the duration of the quarantine. Instead of being breathed in, SCP-253 spread via direct physical contact. Later close examination would reveal that when an uninfected individual touched the surface neoplasms, also known as tumors, of an infected subject, the condition would begin affecting them too. This led to some of the researchers referring to the phenomenon as the cancer plague. The first symptom of an SCP-253 infection occurs within the initial few hours of contact. This will present itself in the form of skin lesions that begin to emerge in groups of between 3 and 5, located at the point of infection. These lesions are, in humans at least, typically the size of a dime piece, only around 2 centimeters in diameter. Within 12 hours after the first of these lesions appear, the infection will cause tumors to develop within the infected subject's brain. MRI scans conducted on later test subjects confirmed the presence of neoplasms in every person exposed to SCP-253. However, there are no accompanying neurological symptoms brought on by these growths. The headaches, seizures, persistent nausea and vomiting, drowsiness, difficulty with vision or speech, problems with memory or shifts in personality that are all commonly associated with neoplasms in the brain are non-existent in SCP-253 infectees at this stage. This makes early detection difficult without the use of magnetic resonance imaging. The condition then worsens over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours. Human test subjects that the SCP Foundation exposed to SCP-253 following the lockdown gave more of an insight as to what had occurred to the body of the unidentified thief that was infected. The skin lesions present on an infected subject's skin began to not only rapidly increase in size, but in number also, emerging and growing all over the body. These lesions can lead to substantial swelling within the surrounding tissue, and many subjects that have been interviewed at the various stages of their infections have reported that this gives them severe pain. The Foundation was able to determine that by leaving this pain untreated, a subject will become physically debilitated to the point of being no longer able to move. Towards the time of a full 48 hours following an SCP-253 infection, patients affected by the cancer plague will begin to exhibit a number of neurological symptoms that have been attributed to an increased number of neoplasms. These will begin to manifest throughout the subject's lymphatic system, the network of organs like the lymph nodes, lymphatic tissues, and vessels that maintains the balance of bodily fluid levels and helps defend against infection. The neurological symptoms exhibited by each infectee that contracts SCP-253 have varied on a case-by-case basis. Foundation experts in anomalous neurology have examined scans taken of every known test case of an SCP-253 infection and have determined that symptoms are likely dictated by the area of the brain contaminated by the invasive cancer plague cells. Human test subjects who were found to have a higher level of tumors within their hippocampus and other structures within the temporal lobe were more likely to experience memory impairment. Meanwhile, those for whom their amygdala, the area of the brain responsible for emotional processing, was more affected, exhibited signs of altered emotional responses, in particular when the infection was explained to them. One D-Class member with neoplasms in their amygdala seemed to suffer a psychological snap upon being told that the Foundation had given them an infectious form of cancer. They began laughing hysterically to such an extreme degree that it induced vomiting and permanent vocal cord damage. Other subjects have reported an inability to focus their attention or exhibited disorganization with their speech as a result of the neurological impact from SCP-253. Hallucinations have occurred for some human test subjects, while others experience states of euphoria, megalomania, sociopathy, or even a complete catatonia as the neoplasms stack within their lymphatic system and brain. Within 47 to 49 hours after the initial infection, patients will no longer experience any pain relating to their symptoms, with any induced by the lesions or neurological pain such as headaches will cease at this point. At random during their human testing trials, the Foundation selected members of D-Class personnel to be submitted for treatment to potentially mitigate the effects of their rapidly forming neoplasms. Attempts were made via radiation therapy and chemotherapy, with the latter being observed to kill some of the anomalous SCP-253 cells. However, its effects were minimal. A high-dose mixture of mitoxantrone, irinotecan, and dacarbazine is believed by Foundation biologist teams to be able to treat SCP-253 shortly after exposure, but it is unable to effectively counteract the cancer plague once the disease has established itself within a human body. It remains unknown whether there is an ideal time frame to administer chemotherapy after an SCP-253 infection. Estimates state that if this doesn't occur within the first few minutes of contact with another infected subject, then there is little chance a patient can be saved. Within 5 days, the symptoms of an SCP-253 infection will once again worsen. If the mass of anomalous cancer cells are allowed to reach a biomass threshold of approximately 3,100 pounds, then they will overwhelm the infected host. Death of the human subject occurs at this point, and if the cancer plague is not transferred to a new host, the cells will continue to posthumously rapidly grow and spread. These cells will become highly aggressive, consuming any remaining usable biomass from their host's corpse. If they are unable to consume enough resources, the SCP-253 cells will begin to die, unless they are contracted by another living host. However, an additional anomalous effect of the plague was observed by the research teams trapped in the lockdown. The body of the intended thief was kept within the testing lab, having seemingly expired shortly after becoming infected, but before this infection was discovered, at which point the lockdown was initiated. Dying while the mandatory Foundation quarantine was still in effect, the mass of cancer cells within the expired corpse and the nearby lab mice that were also infected continued to build. After reaching a certain threshold, researchers noticed something strange occurred within the dead host. It started moving. Electromagnetic phenomena appears to occur when this mass threshold is crossed, and while the exact mechanism of this electromagnetic manipulation is not fully understood, it seems to emanate from the infected subjects themselves. Naturally, when this occurred during the site redacted lockdown, research teams trapped inside with the infected cadaver and accompanying rodents carrying SCP-253 began to panic. It appeared that the electromagnetic emanations occurring within the infected subjects facilitated some kind of shared communication between multiple hosts carrying the plague. Coordinating their movement through their neoplasms, the corpse and infected mice within the lab began to move and act as one singular entity, spread throughout several bodies. Frantically, the Foundation biological research teams began attempting to flee from the biochemical testing wing, but were unable to leave while the mandatory lockdown was still in effect. As they pleaded with high-ranking Foundation personnel via radio for the lockdown to be lifted, the infected entity was able to break free from the lab. The creature was observed via security surveillance cameras. Analysis of its behavior has reached a conclusion that its intelligence is based on a gestalt of the remaining brain tissue within the SCP-253 hosts. In this case, there was little left of the human subject's brain, supplemented only by the infected mice that were now forming part of the same entity. It was highly reactive to stimuli and animalistic in nature, causing it to lash out defensively when members of the research team trapped with it attempted to fight the creature. It has since been hypothesized that an infected entity of this nature could possess an almost human level of intellect if enough SCP-253 hosts were able to be combined using this method. Research on the discovery of SCP-253 seems to suggest that the more unsettling incidents that took place at Redacted Hospital were the result of manifestations like this. Research into testing the exact biomass threshold that causes these manifestations in human subjects has been denied by the Foundation's Ethics Committee. However, a decision on whether or not biomass can be tested within controlled cell culture samples is still pending. Until such a time that the Foundation is able to jam the electromagnetic manipulation that creates one of these late-stage infection entities, however, the manifestation of any conjoined SCP-253 creatures is to be prevented at all costs. Samples of the anomalous SCP-253 cells are to be handled with the utmost care. The SCP Foundation is still awaiting a time when more effective cancer treatments are released to the public, as more common usage will allow them to counteract any future infections of the cancer plague. Experiments involving the use of SCP-427 to counteract SCP-253 have been approved. SCP-427 is an anomalous locket that can regenerate any and all forms of bodily damage, as well as healing infections and improving the efficiency of all bodily systems of the person wearing it. However, continuous use of SCP-427 causes the user to become a large, violent mass of flesh. Initial testing results were not encouraging, as despite SCP-427's effectiveness at treating other forms of cancer, it seemed to accelerate the growth rate of tumors in SCP-253 infectees rather than reducing them. All subjects were terminated before they could approach the critical threshold that would trigger a creature manifestation. Requests to allow human patients beyond this threshold are still pending. At present, SCP-253 poses a clear and ever-present threat to human life. The Foundation has enacted Level 4 biosafety protocols in order to maintain the safety of humanity and prevent a potential massive-scale outbreak of the cancer plague. All research involving SCP-253 samples is to be conducted at Site Redacted, given that this is one of the most geographically isolated Foundation facilities. Incineration and irradiation protocols can be swiftly enacted here, and the site does not possess a diverse enough biosphere to allow for contaminations to spread easily. Should any of the following events occur, then sterilization protocols will be enacted. If there is a communications blackout at Site Redacted that lasts longer than 48 consecutive hours, if there is disruption to power distribution systems for longer than a single minute during any experiments involving SCP-253, should an abnormal rise in temperatures occur, higher than a change of 11 degrees Fahrenheit, or a rise in humidity levels to 90% relative humidity, then the site will be sterilized. This will also occur if any unusual electromagnetic phenomena are detected during testing with SCP-253. At the conclusion of any tests, subjects that have been exposed to SCP-253 are to be disposed of. Their remains are also subject to sterilization protocols. Any researcher who leaves the grounds of Site redacted must undergo 2 weeks of mandatory chemotherapy treatment in case of accidental infection, followed by a further 15-day quarantine. Check out the DrBob Patreon and become a junior researcher today. Now go and watch another entry from the files of DrBob, like SCP-420, Aggressive Skin Condition.